Good day and welcome back everyone. In this video we'll be looking at the CSS position property and how we can use it to position different elements on our web page. Now let's go into our code editor, and as always let's start from this h1 tag. Now the position property has all these values which are valid. So we have the absolute position, we have the fixed position, we have the relative, static, sticky, inherit and initial. So those are the basic ones that are used when positioning an element. So we'll go through them one by one. So let's look at the absolute position. Now the absolute position, what it does is it takes this h1 element out of the normal flow of this web page. So here now, if we refresh, you can see that this is now being at the top, because since this is position absolute, it is no longer in the normal flow of this web page. So, and also note, absolute position elements are always positioned relative to their parent, which means that since the parent of this h1 tag is this body tag, so it's positioned relative to the last relative positioned element. So we'll explain that furthermore, but let's just look at what we can do with this position element. Now we can move this h1 element around this page, and we can do that using these four properties, and those are, we have the top, we have bottom, we have left, and we have right. So these four properties can be used to position this element on our page. So as you can see, with all those properties now, it is scaled up to fill the entire page. So now let's say we want to move this from the left to the right here. Now to do that, all we just have to set is we set the right to 0. So now this element will now be positioned to the right of the parent. So if we go back and refresh, you see now that we have this element at the right here. Now, but let's say we want to position it at the right bottom. If you may have guessed, we use the right property and also set bottom to 0. Then if you go back and refresh, you would see that we have it now at the right bottom of our page, the bottom right of our page. So same thing, if you want to have it at the bottom left, just change the right to left and we will have it here, or left top. So that's the default position. So that's how you can use those elements to move this around. And we can also use, just like the margin properties and padding properties, you can use the CSS units such as percentage or pixels or rem. So let's set this now to 50%. So this element will be positioned 50% from the top, okay, from the left. Well, if we set this now also to the top, and we have this result. So you can just play around with this and see the results you can get with it. So now let's move over to other position types. So we have, okay, let's get rid of this and set position. Okay, so the next in line we have is the position of fixed. Now setting a position of fixed will set, just like the name implies, implies we'll set that element fixed to the page. So first of all, let's mute all these properties. So if we refresh, now we have this. It still works in the same way as absolute, but this time if we have this page now to scroll, so let's just get some text in here. So now if we have some scrolling text in our page, you will see that as we scroll, this element remains fixed to the page, and that's just what the position fixed is used for. And to know the difference, if you set this now to position absolute, it is not fixed to the page, and when we scroll, that element also goes. So that's the major difference between the position absolute and position fixed. And same as the absolute positioning, you can also move this element all around this page. So if I wanted this to be at bottom right, so you can just set bottom 0 and right 0, and that's it. And so now after that, let's look at the z-index property before we move over to other position property types. So let's say we have a div here, and let's make it a div with a solid color of, let's say, okay, red. And now we can just go to your CSS and style this div. So we want to give it a background color of red, be a width of 500 pixels. So we'll give it the same height, 500 pixels, and let's see the result we have now. So yes, we have this box. Let's put this back and let's remove these properties. So we have only the position property. Okay, let's change the color of this border to something visible like green. Now let's say in this page we have something like the z-index property, and we'll set this to 1000. Now we can put this to -1. So now basically this is now underneath all these other elements, and that's because of the z-index property. So what the z-index property does is it helps you decide which element you want to overlap which. So as you can see, this is overlapping this. So this element here that is carrying CSS is cool. It's below every text, every element on this page, and that's because of the z-index, which is set to -1. So let's say our z-index is 0, and note the lower the z-index, or more like an element with a higher z-index will always overlap another element with a lower z-index. So let's refresh this page. Now we have z-index set to 0, and now you can see our element is now being shown properly. So let's give this here a position of absolute, and also give this box a position of absolute, and let's see what happens. So refresh this page, and as you can see, we can't see our CSS is cool h1 element because the z index of this red box is higher than the z index of this h1 element. Now this is set to 1000. If I set this to 10 and set this to 11, you'll see that our CSS is cool will now appear above the red box. So that's how you can just use the z-index property to make absolutely positioned elements to overlap on top of each other. So that's just basically just to show you how you can do something like that. And now let's continue with the position property. So now we've looked at the position fixed and position absolute. Now let's look at the position relative. Now what the position relative does is it doesn't take the element out of the normal flow of the web page, but rather it positions it relative to where the element is meant to be. So now this element is at the top, and since we've set position to relative, we can now have access to use these properties, which is the top. So now we can make it appear 100 pixels from the top of where it's originally supposed to be. So if we save this, you'll see what I'm talking about. So now you can see this is where this element is normally supposed to be, but since we positioned it relative, now this element is positioned relative to where it was originally meant to be. So now the top that we added, the space on the top that we added, which is 100 pixels, is now 100 pixels from where it's originally meant to be. So now let's look at this with another property. Let's look at it with the, let's say, container property, container element rather. So let's set this to position relative, and remember it does not affect the layout of where the element is meant to actually be. So now since this is position relative to where it's originally meant to be, which is this section of our page, if I add a top of 200 pixels, now this element will now be positioned 200 pixels away from where it is originally meant to be, which is here. So if you refresh this, you can see this is the container and it is positioned 200 pixels from where it originally was. So let's say this container had a background color of blue, so now it's in a situation like this where your z-index property can become really useful or helpful rather. So let's say this, so the text class name is what's containing all that text. So let's set the z-index to, let's say, something like 10. Now if we refresh this page, okay, that doesn't take effect. To use the z-index, we have to set a position for our element, and we'll just use the position relative because that doesn't affect where this element will be located. So now you can see our element now is above this container, but what you can still see the color is this, the text div does not have a background color. So if I set a background color of just anything, let's go for gray, you'll see that this now is above this. So that's just basically the position relative property in a nutshell. So now let's move on. Now another position property that we have is the position static. Now the position static just positioned it this is the default value for the position. This is the default value for every element in HTML. So every element by default is positioned statically, so you do not have to change this unless you're working with external libraries which set positions on an element which you may now want to change. So, and that property that we have, or property value, is the position sticky. Now the position sticky is very unique because we can use it to set our elements to remain at a particular place on our page as the user scrolls. So a practical example will be, let's put this on this h1 tag, and let's put this h1 tag below our red box. So now we have something like this. Now let's say this h1 tag now is our navigation bar, and we want that as the user scrolls, once the navigation bar gets to the top, we want the navigation bar to remain at the top so our user can always see it as they navigate the website. That is where you use the sticky property or the sticky position. So now to use that, you set the position to sticky and you use the top and set a threshold. So if you want that when the user gets to 0, which is at the top of the page, this should get stuck to the top. So after setting that, you will see that when you scroll, once this element gets to the top, it remains there. So that's it. And once your scroll position gets back to where this element was originally meant to be, it will go back and filing. So you can set this threshold to anything you want. You can set it to 100 pixels or 200 or whatever you want. But once the user gets to 100 pixels above this element, it will become sticky. So that's it. So something more reasonable for something like a navigation bar could be something like, let's say, 20 pixels and yes. So this works both ways. You can use it for both top and bottom. So if I set this now to position sticky bottom, when I scroll and get this to the bottom, you'll see that it sticks to the bottom. So to see that more in effect, let's put this below our image, or rather, let's just put it below the text so we can have more space to work with. So if we refresh, you'll see now that we have our image sticking to the bottom when we get to that threshold that has been set. So that's the position, that's the sticky position. Now let's move on, and we have the inherit and initial. So basically the inherit just does what it says. This makes whatever element you're setting this on to inherit the position from its parent element. So if this h1 tag is in a div that is set to position absolute, this will also be positioned absolutely. And position initial just basically sets the position property to the default value, which is static. So now that's basically it for the position property. You can see how you can use it to position elements in different ways on your website. So I recommend you to play around with this and just mix up things a bit and see how you can see the things you can create with it. And any problems you have, you can always just search up on Google or just ask questions in the comment section, And that will be all for today, and I will see you in the next video, and bye for now.